Hi, and welcome to our talk about consulting, a career with Deloitte. I'm Chris, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what consulting is, especially from a technology point of view, because obviously consulting tends to have more of a business connotation, but what we do is a little bit of business, but a lot of technology, which to us at least is usually the more exciting part, and hopefully for you too. So let me give you a quick introduction about myself. So I, as you can probably see from the video, have a lot more hair than I do in this photo. I should get that updated at some point. I have not yet. I started it with Deloitte in mid-2015, so I've been doing this for about 6 years now. I started as a grad. I actually went to QUT, don't hate me. I did do a couple of subjects over here at UQ, so I kind of did a little bit of a cross-river exchange. Far more paperwork than you'd expect to go a block down the road, but I did it. Now I'm a technical lead engineering manager, so I work leading teams of developers, mostly in C#.NET, but I also do a lot of architecture work for both AWS and Azure, so I bounce backwards and forwards a lot. I've worked for a wide variety of clients and industries in that time, so I've worked for like travel and leisure companies, I've worked for fast food chains, I've worked for government, banks, almost every sector you could probably imagine within Brisbane at least. I've had some sort of touch upon those 6 years. But I wanted to start with talking about like what actually is consulting, right? Because again, it's kind of like a weird term that people throw around a lot, has different meaning for different people. Some people will probably disagree with my meaning. I obviously like it because I put it on these slides. But really like the core of consulting is applied problem solving. So it's not just theoretical, I'm sitting in a room being like, if I could solve this, this is what I would do. Most of what we do at least is actually applying that, right? It's like, if I could solve this, this is what I would do, and also I'm gonna go do it. So there's kind of two parts to it, right? There's the advisory part and the implementation part. And advisory is kind of more like traditional consulting, and that's not a bad thing in the context we have. I'm not trying to say this to say advisory is bad, because we absolutely do advisory work in consulting, and it is important, especially in the tech space. And what advisory is at its really core is looking at the current state of a business or an organization or a tech stack or a software solution or whatever the actual thing you're working with might be. Working out what it should be in a perfect world, and then providing like a roadmap to go from where it is now to where it should be in, a reasonable amount of time based on the organization and the people involved and the money and what other aspects and factors might be involved. The other side of that obviously is implementation, right? So with advisory, you sort of generate a set of recommendations, you provide it to a client. They may implement it, they may not, they may implement it poorly, you may come back and implement it later. There's a lot of different ways that can go that's a bit less tangible. Implementation is a lot more tangible in what you deliver. So you're delivering a thing. That thing could vary. So if you're a graphic designer, it could be visual designs and like a logo and branding and colors. If you're a software engineer, it's code, usually as an application. Code on its own is not normally that useful, but a fully developed application with testing and deployed to production is usually the output we deliver most of the time. So for us, a lot of what we do is implementation, and that implementation is usually in the form of web or mobile apps, right? So we're delivering web, mobile apps, APIs, some combination thereof. Really important to note that for both roles, technical and problem solving skills are super important. Even for advisory, the advisory work we do is usually very, very technical. So it's not like, hey, you should cut stuff. That's what normal business people do. What we do is hey, your tech stack's old and your CI/CD pipelines aren't optimized and you're spending way too much money on this AWS thing when you should be spending money on this AWS thing because it's more efficient, and that kind of advisory work, right? So to give you an example of where that kind of comes in, something a little bit more tangible. So the reason why companies come to us as consultants is because a company has a problem that it can't solve itself, right? So it has to go external to find someone who can solve it for them or with them. Ideally with them, sometimes it's just for them, but ideally we would rather be with them, right? So some examples of what that looks like from a practical sense that we've dealt with in just our day-to-day jobs, right, is really common one is the company just doesn't have an internal development team, right? If you're a big company that sells shoes, for example, you might have a Shopify store, but if you're trying to build an in-house app to do custom shoe designs and coloring and things, it's getting better, but there's still not a huge ecosystem for those kind of apps out of the box. And so if you need to quickly build one yourself, you don't really want to have to go and hire devs, architects, designers, DevOps engineers, someone to test it. Like, there's a lot of hiring you would have to do to basically stand up a team from scratch, right? So in that kind of sense, that's where consulting makes sense, because you can go get any part of that team end to end or small subsets as needed, and have them do that part of the work for you. So yeah, you also might just have a team that doesn't have the ability or capacity to work on it, right? Like if you've got a small in-house team, and most of what they do is keep the current business stuff running, they don't necessarily have capacity to go build new things, right? So when you've got a new product or a new feature you want to build, rather than hiring a bunch of people on a short-term basis or bringing in contractors that then you have to manage yourself and upskill and get up to speed, again, go out to a consultancy, they can do that part for you, they look after it all, and at the end deliver the final product with you. Or, again, if you don't have the right skills within that team, and this is particularly true for some of the really specialized skills you'll see around, so things like, if you're like especially a cloud architect, like if you're AWS or Azure cloud architect, a lot of people have that skill now, but traditionally, like that's been a fairly specialized skill that people have had, and you bring them in to come and do the architecture design at the start, and they might even hand it over to an internal team, and they'll move on, and the internal team will then go and do whatever it was. Same thing for people like penetration testers, like you're not usually getting your site or app penetration tested every day. You'll bring it in when you've got a new release or a big feature, they'll do that, then they'll move on to the next one. So same kind of thing for those kind of specialized skills, right? And these are all examples of those more implementation style consulting projects, right? So the client kind of knows what it is they want, they just don't have the ability to do it themselves, and so they're bringing in consultants to do it for them. That's opposed to the more advisory style work, which is where the client doesn't really know what it is they want, and they need someone to come in and like point them in the right direction for whatever is going wrong, right? They kind of have this idea that something might be wrong. They don't know what, they'll bring some people in to advise them as to what it is, and that may then lead to implementation, it may not. So examples for that, really common one is, hey, we've got a team of devs, they're churning through tickets in Jira, but I'm not really seeing like stuff in production for my customers. Why is that? And I feel like a lot of the people who bring us in, right, are like business directors and business executives, and they're the people who are like that entry point into an organization. And from their point of view, often it's just communication, it's fixing that, it's trying to identify why there's this disconnect between what they're expecting and what like a team is delivering. From my experience at least, it's often not that a team isn't delivering things, it's that there's a disconnect in the communication between them, because IT people, we tend not to like to talk to business people, so there's always like a bit of a disconnect there. Another really common one is, hey, my current platform goes up and down all the time, no one can figure out why it's so unstable, we're spending way too much money for this thing that's constantly going down, how do we fix it? The other one that I've seen quite a lot is, again, people who bring us in are usually directors and executives, and they'll swap between companies, come into a new company and go, hey, we've got this old system that like runs the banking industry, and no one seems to know how it works. Can you tell us how it works, and also like if we should replace it? And that kind of stuff, like extreme example, but that kind of stuff does happen too, right? And again, that's where the advisory one comes in, because they kind of know something's up, but it's not specific enough to be like, hey, we need a new core banking system. It's like, hey, our core banking system, no one seems to know, what should we do, right? So that's sort of why businesses hire consultants. But like, why as a student should you care about being a consultant, right? Because when I was at uni, did not know what a consultant was, definitely thought they were a business person. Like honestly, like literally, like I was talking about this earlier to the guys, stumbled into this job on like an internship and just fell in love with it, but like would have had no idea this role existed like when I was at uni. I think that's still mostly the case. So why would you become a consultant, especially in tech? Well, the main thing is problem solving. Like I love solving problems, and like 90% of my day job is solving problems. It's not always the problems I want to solve, but it usually is interesting at least. Like no one's really going out and hiring consultants to come in and solve easy problems. If they were easy, they would have done it themselves, right? We're coming in to solve the really challenging problems that these big companies have but can't figure out themselves. You get a huge variety of access, different industries, different working styles, different technologies, different locations, different tools, different people, different platforms, different sizes of teams, different sizes of projects, different sizes of companies you're dealing with. No two projects are the same, because everything about every project is slightly different as you move around from role to role and role. There's always a new one coming up too, so if for whatever reason you don't like the current project, there's a new one coming up pretty soon. Like there's always, the projects we do vary from 3 to 4 weeks to 3 to 4 months to 1 to 2 years, right? Like it's rare we'll do one for more than 2 years, and if we do, it's rare that it'll be the same team throughout. People will rotate on and off. But the scale-up project is usually like up to a couple of years at most. And realistically, especially in Brisbane, most of it's up to 6 months or so, right? Like it's rare for us to do anything more than that just because the scale-up projects doesn't need to be that big, right? So you're always getting new things. You get that kind of experience of like jumping jobs to something more interesting, but you've got the stability of having a job and a career progression that's like quite logical. So growth and learning opportunities is another one. So I probably shouldn't say this, but one thing that does happen quite a lot is people will start out in consulting, get a lot of experience, get a lot of practical experience, and then sort of leapfrog people who go into industry, right? So they'll finish uni at the same time as someone from industry, do consulting for a couple of years, and then decide they find like a skill they really like or a role they really like somewhere else. They decide to go into industry, but it's usually 1 to 2 levels above where they would have been if they'd done it through industry, right? So it is legitimately like a good way to accelerate your career. Obviously, I'd rather people stay, but I also understand how careers go, right? Like people want different things at different parts of their life and their career. The other big one that used to get a lot of people is travel. Obviously not a lot of travel right now, probably again soon. Although most consulting companies, and I know definitely us, are like remote first now. So like I work from home 3 to 4 days a week. That's mostly because I want to come in and be social 1 or 2 days a week. It's not that I have to be in the office 1 or 2 days a week. So like most businesses, right? Like that's a big thing at the moment is most places are remote first now. So why not? So as much as I enjoy consulting, it's definitely not for everyone. I don't want to be here and be like, you should definitely do a career in consulting. Like it's great if you're in the mindset that this appeals to. I absolutely would recommend it, but it's not for everyone, right? There's plenty of legitimate reasons why you might not enjoy consulting. So one is routine. Like routine is not impossible, but it's definitely a lot harder to maintain a good routine while you're working in consulting. Because again, you're swapping between projects, you're often swapping between roles, swapping between clients. They might be in different locations. A bit easier now that it's remote, but if you are going out to visit clients and things, like we work a lot at client offices. So if you're going out to visit clients quite a lot too, like they could vary all around the city. So like putting that routine can be harder. If you've got like a really specific role or like industry you want to work in as well, obviously with consulting, like it's driven by what our clients need. So we can't just create roles for specific things, whereas some companies can. So if you're like really specifically want to work in like a certain role or a certain industry, we can sort of accommodate one or the other, but it's hard for us to accommodate both, right? If you're like, I want to be an architect, but only for emergency medical systems, it's hard for us to be like, that's the only thing you're going to do as your role. Like it's going to be dictated by what projects are available. But the fact that we work in basically every industry and basically every role means we can accommodate one or the other. If you only want to focus on the technical or the social aspect of work, but not both, I think is a reason not to get into consulting. Like consulting is definitely a job where you're super, super technical, but you also need to be quite social. So you need to work with people, talk to people. You spend a lot of time talking to clients, even as developers, like you'll meet clients and talk to clients fairly regularly because that's the best way to get feedback on the work you're doing, right? Is get it in front of someone, get someone using it and get that feedback. So if you're not someone who wants to be social or you're not someone who wants to be as technical, it's not a great fit unless you've got the combination of both. And if you don't like ambiguity or unknowns, and like that, I don't mean that as a negative, like there's definitely people who would much rather have like, here's the set thing I'm working on each day and I'm gonna go and do that. But a lot of what we do is like, every day is quite different. So if you're someone who's like thrown off by having something different every day and not necessarily going into a day knowing the exact things you're gonna do that day, like it can cause problems, right? Like it's not always gonna be that way in consulting. So I'm gonna give you like a little bit of my perspective on things as like a back-end engineer or software engineer. So like I said, I started 6 years ago now as a grad doing .NET C# work. My first 3 to 4 years was pretty much primarily day-to-day writing code. I did client meetings and like some of the other stuff around that. Like I'd say like my main role, right, was just sitting down and writing code. And as I've gotten more experience, like I've sort of transitioned now into a more management role. I write less code these days. I do a lot more architecture, and like my day-to-day is running a team of developers, right? So I'm like usually attending all the meetings so they don't have to. As most of you can probably understand, like flow is really important for developers, so making sure you can keep that flow going while you're actually writing the code. So I see a big part of my job these days shielding my team from other people so that they have the focus and the flow to keep working and not be distracted as much by all the different business requirements and business things coming in, and I can kind of be the buffer between them and that, right? That's a choice I made. That's not a thing that has to happen. Like a stereotype in engineering in general is that as you get more senior, you get off the tools and you go more into management. And I can't speak for other areas, but I know definitely for what we do in consulting, like that's not a requirement. Like we've got people far more senior than me that spend far more of their day writing code because that's what they want to do, and there's avenues for them to do that as well. But for me, like a typical day is, like I start my mornings with a stand-up with the team, check in, see how they're going. Like I said, usually 2 to 3 different check-ins a day at the moment, just because of the state we are in projects. Trying to make sure my team are unblocked. So when developers are running into issues, doing what I can to find ways to unblock them. And then most of the code I do write these days is proof of concepts, like designs, examples, like, hey, we need something to, read an access token from some new library. Cool, here's a quick little proof of concept to show it can be done and rough guideline on how to do it. Hand it over to the dev team, let them build the proper version of it, and then we'll implement it. The other thing I do a lot of personally is code reviews, so like usual cycle of writing code, raising a PR, reviewing that, and then it's usually 2 reviewers, so it's usually one of the other developers and then myself as the other reviewer for most of the PRs that go through at the moment. So in my time, I've had lots of different projects I've worked on, and I thought just to give you an idea of what it looks like for a software engineer in consulting, I'll just give you a couple of examples of the roles I've had, right? So that's kind of like a day in the life of me right now. But as I started as a grad, I started out with a travel and leisure company. It's not that much of a secret, but I feel weird saying client names, so I'll talk about industries rather than clients, just it's a thing. So I started out with a travel and leisure company working on a project basically fresh out of uni. So I started as a grad, and about 6 weeks in, moved on to this project where I was like one of the primary devs. I had a senior dev working above me that I worked closely with, and he sort of mentored me and coached me and showed me how to work. But the project was to integrate a bunch of different systems into this one website. So they have like all the different things you need to travel overseas, like foreign currency card, travel insurance, travel itinerary, booking flights, booking accommodation, booking rental cars, like basically everything you can think of. There's about 21 different integration points we use for this client. So 21 different third parties that are probably the most unstable APIs I have ever seen in my life. We literally built a war at one point that was just the 20 different APIs or 21 different APIs with like a happy or a sad face. And every morning the first person in the office would like run a script to hit all of them to see which ones are up or down and just update all the faces based on which ones were awake and which ones weren't. Because it literally was about half and not the same half every day. So like some would be up, some would be down, the next day they'd be different. And because of the nature of the project, the companies we were working with were people like MasterCard and like Covermore, and these people are like got offices all around the globe, right? So they'd have teams like MasterCard's based out of the UK, so they're working on a completely different time zone than us. And so trying to do that transition of us getting to the end of the day, being like, hey, all this stuff is broken, MasterCard works to the night our time, and then the next day, everything's working again, that's great. And then some other thing's broken from someone else, and it's that constant cycle, right? So again, dealing with ambiguity, like we'd come into the office every day not knowing if the component I was working on would work, because the third party would be down. So that was super challenging trying to deal with that and manage that, but so interesting because you, straight as a grad, like all these different projects, all these different integration points, learned so much about how to manage that, how to deal with stuff going up and down, how to deal with ambiguity, how to deal with things being on fire, like right before showcases to clients. Like you learn so much interesting stuff from doing that that really shaped me in my career now. Apart from that, like I've done some work for places like fast food places, completely different skill set, completely different use case, like trying to work out, optimal travel distances. So if you're doing deliveries, like I've got one person on one side of the city, one person on the other side of the city, how do I optimize the routes so both of them get their food and it's not cold, it's hot, and like all these really interesting like kind of problems that you don't normally think about outside of that industry. But by being in that role, you sort of come in and then have to immediately get this crash course and like, here's how deliveries work. And like so many interesting things you just never would consider, right? Similar thing with elections. So for one of the states, I worked with the state government on helping update their election system. So getting back to the point about the problems, right? Like clients come to you because they've got a problem they can't solve themselves. And in this case, they thought they had a problem that they couldn't solve themselves, and it turns out they had a few problems, and some they could solve themselves, and some they couldn't, and some we helped them with. So we were sort of brought in to build this user-facing website. In this case, the users are like everyone in that state, right? Like it's a pretty well-known group of users because it's election results. And we weren't working with the actual inputting of election results, but the outputting of like, here's the voting counts as they get updated live to the website. And that gets quite complicated for a whole bunch of reasons I don't have time to get into about how votes get counted. And I learned so much about how elections work in that state, which is not our state. So it doesn't really help me, but it's super interesting to learn. But But in doing that, we realized that they didn't have a lot of understanding about how the system worked either. And so the problem we thought they had was they need a way to display the election results, but the problem they actually had was they needed to understand how those results, the output got calculated. And obviously the whole thing's like, to be clear, like the whole thing is very heavily audited and like managed. Like there wasn't any issues with the election results. It's just the people working with the technology side of it didn't necessarily understand how all of it worked. They didn't need to because it wasn't their job, but it really benefited their job to understand it. But there's no way for them to do that. And so we had to come in, help them understand it, guide them along that journey. We built the sort of front end representation of it. And then the end result was that we built this about 6 months before the election because you want to have some time in case something goes wrong. And then when we went live, we didn't even realize that they were running the election because it had gone so smoothly that we basically got like a message the weekend afterwards being like, hey, election went well. And we were sitting around in Queensland being like, oh, didn't even know the election was on that weekend, glad it went well. Which is probably like the best praise you can have, right? They didn't need us involved, everything worked just fine. From a shadier business practice, it's bad, right? Because we could have done it in a way that would have made it harder for them to continue to do that without us. But like, there's a lot of ethical parts of consulting, right? And like ethical consulting, like we want them to be able to manage it themselves. The more we have to get involved, the worse a job we have done helping them get up to speed. Because at the end of the day, we're solving a problem for them, not for us. And so like for us, it's really important that we're in there and helping them understand what they're doing and being able to manage it moving forward rather than just sort of being like, here's the thing, call us when it breaks. So that was a really, like for me, like one of my favorite moments was them being like, the election all worked and we didn't even have to like lift a finger or get involved at all. So there's a couple of big examples for me about what it's like from my role as a software engineer, some personal examples, and also what consulting as a whole is for people in technology and software. I'm going to hand over to Anshul now to talk a little bit about what it's like from a front-end perspective and making the code I make look pretty to users, which is always very, very, very important.
Hey everyone, I'm Anshul and I'm currently working at Deloitte as a consulting Fed, and I did a bachelor's of information technology from QUT with a major in computer science and graduated last year, July. But yeah, so I've been working in multiple different industries since then, and it ranges from computer software to health and insurance, just a few of them. So what is a Fed? Well, I actually just noticed it says the role right there. I had an interesting story to tell, but when I first started working at Deloitte, I was chatting with a buddy of mine, and then we had a whole conversation about how someone from a different part of the team is actually trying to be a Fed, and I'm just in my mind confused, like why is someone trying to be a federal agent? So it's definitely not that. But yeah, so a Fed is pretty much basically who develops a website and creates a user experience for people to interact with, and where they can input and retrieve information from a beautiful, functional, accessible, and an engaging user experience. Now, the tools and technologies definitely differ a lot because it really depends on what the client wants and what sort of work that you're trying to do. So you could be using completely different technologies, and then because there's just like a whole range of technologies that you can be using as a Fed. Now, I also like to think of Fed as a combination of art and logic. Now, if you think you're someone who's really creative and also likes programming, Fed is probably one of the best perfect role that you can find out there. And that's one of the reasons I decided to work as a Fed, because when you're working as a Fed, your work usually, it's all happening behind the scenes. So when I decided to be a Fed, I want the work out there for people to be able to see my work out there and interact with it, so it's out there. Now, what's it like being a Fed consultant instead of just being a Fed in one of these industries that I worked in at the past? Now, I've only been a consultant at Deloitte for about 6 weeks, so I'm probably going to tell you what it's like been so far, and one of the reasons why I switched to become a consultant and not something else. As I mentioned earlier, so I've got approximately 2 years of experience working in the industry, and then one of the biggest problems that I had that I always had project fatigue, so I could only work on a project for about 6 months, maybe a year max pushing, if I'm really pushing it, and then I would get tired of the project and I would want to work on new things. Now, there's an issue with that, which is obviously you can't keep switching companies every year. It's going to look bad on your resume, and you don't want to do that. So one of the key things being a consultant actually helps with that is because working as one, it actually gives me the exposure that I need as well, with all the different sorts of projects that I can be on, and it also solves a problem that I mentioned earlier. So I don't have to leave the company to be working on different projects. It also actually helps me build my social side of the professional and both personal social aspects of my life as well, because I work with clients, I get to work with clients and getting to know them on a social level. And that doesn't really just take the professional aspects and what I want to be as in my personal life as well, and trying to implement all these skills that I get by being a consultant and putting it into my personal life. With the abundance of projects that I get to work on, I'm more likely to find the technologies and the type of projects that resonates with me and what actually doesn't work for me. Now, working on different projects gives me a perspective on and what I can be working on in the future. It narrows down the career path that I want to take on in the future, and I don't have to experiment by going to different countries. That's what being a consultant is probably one of the best ways you can find out what actually works for you and what doesn't. I hope I've painted a good enough picture of what being a Fed consultant is like. I'll be handing over to Riley, who's going to give a perspective on what it's like being a BA and what the business side of it looks like.
Hello.
There
Am I here? Okay, cool. Hi everyone, I'm Riley. So I'm a business analyst at Deloitte. I've been at the company for maybe 18 months now. So I've had a fair few trials and a few projects. So it's really interesting to hear, Anshul, that what you said actually really resonated with me without realizing that that was an issue for me as well, of wanting to trial a new project. Like you get a little bit itchy after 6 or so months doing the same thing. So it's definitely very true, and something that I've enjoyed in my time at consulting. So I did come over as a lateral hire. I ended up in technology in a very strange way. I was actually working in-house in a legal division at an investment management fund. One of our subsidiaries was a fintech, and I just was really interested in what they were doing. It looked very, very cool. It looked very exciting. Lauren and being a legal practitioner and a business analyst, it's actually quite similar. And that's how I sort of stumbled into being interested in tech and solutions, because it's all about, again, we're going back to this conversation about what's the problem and what's the best answer for this, and what solutions can we find that would best fit the needs of all of the various entities that are involved there. So, I jumped ahead, sorry. That's essentially how I fell into consulting. I was working at that fintech for a while, and I really enjoyed it, but there was this lure that consulting had, as opposed to working at the same entity for a while, for exactly what Anshul was saying. You get a little bit itchy after a while, and consulting really provided that opportunity to grow. I know that's really cliche, but working at a firm, particularly like Deloitte, you're working with top tier professionals. So there's a few things that I was really interested in that Deloitte Digital has 110% provided. One is variety, despite the fact that I've stayed in financial services because it's absolutely the area that I'm most interested in. You get to work with different clients and you get to solve different problems. You also get to work with a really big range of professionals who are top tier, and with fantastic solutions as well. So it was that opportunity to work with the best as well as providing the best solutions. And I think that if you are driven for that sort of next level, I think that consulting is certainly the right place to be if you sort of want to push for that extra step. Hopefully that makes sense. It's really quite great at Deloitte Digital. As a business analyst, sorry, I haven't really spoken about that. It's hard to say. We were talking about this earlier as a team, and when we talk about being a business analyst, what my role is really depends on what the client needs. It also depends on what your interests are. We certainly have analysts who are more business aligned. We have analysts who are more right in the middle functional aligned, which is quite in between, what's the UX, what's the technical solution, what are the business needs. That's definitely the core. But then on the other side of that, you also have the more technical business analysts or tech VAs who also will work on what's the solution architecture look like and how is this going to work, and at all of those points and consider what might be needed there. So the room for growth and ability to expand within that and figure out what might your area be, as well as figuring out what your niche area of interest could be. It's really quite great. The big thing though, and I'll just go on to that final point, is what's different about being a BA for consulting in a firm versus industry. I spoke earlier about being itchy. It's not really that. That's just a benefit that you get from working in consulting, that you really get to try different things. For me, really, it was about being the solution focused rather than process focused. So our whole purpose is solving problems. That's essentially the entirety of being a consultant in the best way possible. Whereas depending on the firm and depending on the industry and where you go, but a lot of the time it will be, well, we have to achieve X and we need to do A through D in order to achieve that. Whereas I've found that in consulting it's very much, well, we're not sure what there is to solve. We're going to go in and figure it out. And these are all of the tools and resources that we have in order to do that. And also these are all of the experts in this field that you have direct access to in order to also figure that out. So the benefits are really quite great. I know that sounds like I've really drunk the Kool-Aid. I probably have, but I'm 18 months in and I'm really enjoying it, and I would highly recommend it. So if you're interested, and I think the other final thing that I'll say is that for business analysts, if you are quite technical, don't be afraid of going down the BA route. And I say that because the opportunity is there to essentially grow in whatever area might suit you. And I guess that's the real benefit of being a BA, is that you're right at the center. So like I said earlier, is it the functional aspect? Is it the technical aspect? What are the business needs and issues that you're trying to solve? As a BA, you get to really sit at the heart of that and work directly with the technical team as well as the business and those key stakeholders there as well. If anyone has any questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn or whatever. I'd be happy to help. I'll pass on to Maddie.
Thanks, Riley. Hey everyone, so my name's Maddie. I know that everyone else is a little bit further in their careers, so I'm here as a graduate to bring things back down to perhaps like where you guys are at thinking about graduating. I don't particularly know, maybe you're a bit later in your careers and you're restudying, but I finished my studies in July. I studied at QUT and I did a Bachelor of Information Technology majoring in Computer Science. Also did a minor in behavioural science and some random electives in like UX design. And I also studied at UQ for a little bit, so also please don't hate me. So I'm a front-end developer in the making. At the moment, so I'm only new to Deloitte 4 months in, but that's what I'm kind of going towards. I did an internship at SAP where I did a little bit of front-end development and just loved it, so that's kind of where I want to go. Other than that, I love the outdoors, friends, art and coding. So I'm going to give you guys a fresh perspective because I'm fresh. I'm going to talk about why I picked consulting, some of the qualities that are helpful as a consultant, expectations versus reality, and my 2 cents for all that they are worth. So I'm going to start with why I picked consulting. To start with, I really didn't know what consulting was at all. I kind of saw like a super good grad program that had like a lot of good reviews, and I was like, sign me up. But I also did think about going into industry, and where I was at, I just felt like I wasn't quite as competitive as other applicants, and I just wasn't ready to like commit to something that early on because I still really didn't know what I wanted to do. But I'll go off my slides now. So I picked it to push myself. I knew that there were a ton of aspects in consulting that would really make me push myself. I'm indecisive, going from my change of degrees and changes of unis, and that's just me by nature. So I really wanted to start broad so that I could try a whole heap of things out before jumping into one thing in particular. I also wanted to meet new people. I have gotten to meet a ton of new people. There's about 120 in our grad cohort from March and July. So that's also really nice socially because obviously you get used to your friends at school and uni, and it's nice to push yourself a little bit further and make some new friends. And everyone's super nice. And yeah, that may sound like I've drunk the Kool-Aid as well, but everyone is pretty down to earth. I also love Fed, front-end development, and the position that I applied for, it was Fed specific, so I was super excited about that. Also, very little experience is expected as a graduate, and I know that when you're applying for jobs as a grad, you just look at the ton of like requirements of experience and stuff, and it gets pretty overwhelming. So I really liked that in consulting you could start out really, really fresh and just you're seriously expected to know pretty much nothing on day one, especially if you guys are coming from like a background in computer science and you're applying for a technical role. What they teach you at uni is really good. Like, you'll be fine. The qualities that are helpful as a consultant, it's helpful to enjoy meeting new people because you will meet a lot of new people. Liking change is also helpful. Loving learning is also helpful. Being self-driven, loving a challenge, and thriving in a fast-paced and competitive environment is also great. But also, I used to hate change and I used to hate meeting new people, so I think it's a great opportunity to push yourself, and I'm all about growth and stuff, so like if you at all want to push yourself, like go for it. The worst case scenario, you end up in consulting, you don't like it, you go into industry. And yeah, so now I'm going to go into expectations versus reality. One of my big ones was, so day one, I got my computer shipped to my house because we were in a lockdown, logged on, and I was expecting to be in a team of, say, 5 people. So one of the managers messaged me and was like, hey, like, let me know when you're ready to meet everyone. And I was like, I'm ready now, like, dial me in, I want to meet everyone. And he's like, okay, hold your horses, like there are 60 people in our team. And I was like, oh God, because I thought there would be only 5 of us. And that like got me pretty good. I was pretty shocked to find out there were 60 people. But I've actually like grown to love that because you'd be surprised how quickly you meet everyone if you go to the events and you rock up to the office every now and then. And people are pretty friendly. Your first couple weeks can be a little bit scary, but yeah, they're consultants, they're friendly people. Another one is that resourcing is a really big part of consulting. So in my first week, I was like, what on earth is resourcing? Don't you just give me projects that I want and it all just goes smoothly? It does, but like with consulting work, you're on a project for like a few weeks to a few months, and then you're staffed onto a new project. So sometimes that does take a little bit of advocating if you want to be like taking your career in one direction. It's worth kind of like speaking up about that. So a little bit of self-advocation, if that's a word, is required for consulting sometimes. But again, you can grow that. And what else? So yeah, it's a very dynamic work structure, essentially, which is something that I really didn't expect. Finally, I'm going to finish with my 2 cents. So some advice for if you're looking to do an internship or sign up for a graduate role with a consulting firm. My number 1 piece of advice is be honest about your interests in interviews. So when I was interviewed for a completely different role. I had no idea what on earth like the requirements meant or anything. And I was lucky enough to be interviewed by someone in my direct team who I now know really well. And I told him that, hey, I'm really interested in front-end development. And he was like, you're interviewing for the wrong thing. And he was like, tell the recruiter. So I told the recruiter and she was like, oh, those roles are filled for next year. But I'm a bit of a squeaky wheel and I just kept annoying her and I was like, okay, but could you please let them know that I'm keen, because the other guy I talked to had told me that they're always after front-end developers and everything. So pretty much I emailed her a bajillion times. And eventually I got the role and said a really big thank you to her. So, and they're really lovely, the recruiters, most of them. So one is be honest. And the other thing is I think people think that once you get your foot in the door, it's super easy to transfer teams, when in reality, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult and it can be a bit tricky to get where you want to go if you've already been put in one stream. So I would just be honest from the get-go, especially if you know that something you're applying for is quite in demand, which UQ Computer Science Society, so you guys probably will be in demand. So be a squeaky wheel and also give it time. To be honest, the first couple of weeks of Deloitte I found quite scary. Just consulting in general, there's a lot going on, and they're often very big teams, very big organizations, but if you just give it a bit of time, you really get to know people and it starts to feel like home a bit more. And you start to enjoy the work and you navigate how to get on the projects that you want to be on and everything. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. That's everything from me, guys. And I think that's everything from everyone, isn't it?
Do we have any questions? If anyone has questions, happy to answer a question or two.
Yeah, I'm actually a bit curious about how teams are separated in terms of, do you have a team of front-end developers and a team of back-end developers, or how is that split together when you're working on projects?
Yeah, so I guess to get to that then, the developers are all part of digital, so whether you're front end, whether you're back end, in our case at least, it might be different elsewhere, but in our case at least, the team actually runs the gambit from visual designers and creative people all the way to testers and BAU, sort of site reliability engineers and those kind of people, and everything in between. And we're also the one big team. And then depending on the project, you kind of pick and choose people from the different parts of that team. So though it might be a team of feds or a team of back-end developers or a team of BAs, you're all one team, and it's just that out of that pool of BAs for a certain project, we might need 2 BAs, and so 2 of that group based on who's available at the time. Honestly, a lot of it just comes down to who's available when, but also when you're really upfront about what it is, and to get sort of to what Maddie was saying about being upfront, in interviews, for example, about what it is you want. If you're really upfront about what kind of things you want to be doing and what kind of projects you enjoy, I can say from experience, they will absolutely try and make that work. It doesn't always work 100% of the time, but they will bend over backwards to try and make it work when there is opportunities for that. And so the sort of resourcing that Maddie was talking about is basically looking at, we've got this new project starting, we need, 3 front-end developers now, and then we need 2 back-end developers here, and then we need a tester here, and then we need a couple people to do deployments and testing over here. And it all gets mapped out in our planning and things, and the team as a whole, no matter what project you're on, we're all one digital family. And it's sort of the individual projects might have bits and pieces of that, but the team as a whole for team events and being back in the office and all the kind of regular stuff we do is still all one big team. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
They're very supportive with because Chris is my coach, so you get a careers coach, and so that's what I have to say. No, but truly, they're very supportive in that you have a careers coach and you have a buddy and you have people kind of advocating for you, and you'll often meet the other managers and the directors and the partners, and they all kind of all of our partners and directors know who we are, even as grads, which is really the perks of being in Brisbane as well, because it's a small team. So people want to get you on projects that you want to be on because it's in everyone's interest if everyone's happy and enjoying their work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Say if a client brings in a project that involves software that's not open source and privately owned, and there's no one in the team, like how does that get dealt with?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like, if you didn't hear, I don't know how well that picks up in the recording, but the question was if we have clients and they'll bring in like a software, for example, that like might be closed, we don't have anyone who knows it, they might not have people who know it, what do we do basically, right? Like how do we deal with that? In all honesty, like if that's a situation, they bring in something that we can't work with, we'll probably just tell them that and ask them like, we'll say like, hey, we'd love to help, but we're not going to be able to support you, right? And we're not going to try and like lie to them or like manipulate them into doing something else that's not in their best interests, that's in our interest, right? Like we'll be pretty upfront to say like, hey, this is not something we can do. We might even try and help them find someone who can, particularly if it is like a specialized tool and it's like big enough that someone else might be able to help. We'll try and point them in that direction. If it's something they've developed in-house, that gets more tricky, right? Like then it comes down to like, you know, what is the language? And I can speak from past experience that we've had some projects where people have come to us and said, hey, like we've got this existing code base that's been around for 10 years, it's built in like, for example, PHP, and we don't have anyone in-house who does PHP, and we'll look at it and say like, hey, like your options are basically, we can find someone who can help you with the PHP side if that's what you want, or we can redevelop it in-house, but the cost of us doing it's going to be pretty significant because we don't specialize in doing PHP in that example, right? So like, yeah, we'll be pretty honest about that. Like we do turn down work because of things like that, right? Like if we don't have the skills or we don't have the people, like we will turn down work because it won't be in the customer's best interest, right?
Another question.
Yeah.
So say you provided like a tool or a solution to the customer or product and they're using it, obviously you'll have to deal with like maintenance as well, but you said you work on like different projects as well.
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage that?
Yeah, good question. So usually, so the question was, so we move from project to project, right? So we'll do a project and hand it over to someone and move on to the next one. But then if that client is using it and has issues or maintenance work or things, like how do we deal with that? So the consulting answer is always it depends. Usually the way most projects work is we have a warranty period. So usually 30 days, sometimes longer. But if there's issues with it after that, like we'll have people, we'll pull people, even if someone's moved on to the next project, we'll pull them off that project to go back and do the warranty work if needed. So that's usually built into our plans for how we, again, resource people, right? So we know if they're going to be looking after a warranty period, their new project will know that, and if something comes up, they'll immediately be free to go back and work on whatever the issue was. And then it depends on the project. Like sometimes too, like even beyond the warranty window, if they have issues and they come to us, and even if we don't have a contract with them at the time, like we'll try and support them as best we can. Like often we'll stand up, you know, short-term contracts to come back and look at an issue that's like specific to that issue. There's a lot of like legal overheads, I'm sure Riley can probably attest to, in sort of setting up a new contract, especially for such a small thing. But we will usually do that. In a lot of cases, we also have like maintenance contracts that are like, hey, for the next, we'll give you this thing, and then for the next 3 months, you've got a bucket of money that you can spend to, you know, on different things. So if you've got something that comes up, it's either like a fix for something that wasn't picked up in the build, or if you've like using it in Angra and suddenly realize that you're missing a feature that you need. Like often we'll have like some sort of bucket of money at the end. It's like, here's a sort of fund that you can choose how you want to use, and we can allocate in the next couple of months, just once you've actually got more of a handle on it. So it really depends on like, yeah, the contract with the client and what they want, but we usually got some sort of plan in place at least for that maintenance window, and often like longer to support them for that exact reason, right? Again too, like a lot of the time we'll try and hand over to their team as well, especially if they have, it's not always possible, but if they have an internal team who has somewhat adjacent skills, we'll also usually try and do some sort of handover with them so they can help support it moving forward if we're not around.
So you do give them the source code sometimes, like, or does that depend on the contract?
Depends on the contract, but like, generally speaking, yes, but not always. Yeah, it depends on the contract. Yeah.
Are there any like in-house tools that you use to like support your own like development?
I mean, good question. So we do have some stuff, like we have a bunch of accelerators that we use internally from like a software point of view.
Yeah.
So for different platforms we use, so I can't speak to some of the other teams. I know the front end guys do. From a back end perspective, like I work in C# and we have, you know, a bunch of accelerators for doing APIs, because we do a lot of API work, so we have sort of an out-of-the-box, here's our template for how we build APIs. We use different CMS platforms, right? So like things like Sitecore is the big one for C#, which is a big CMS platform, but we have like an accelerator built around that, so we can roll that out with our kind of technical code design and things in it. We've got a bunch of like testing tools and things. Like we do have a number. Some of that stuff we open source and some we keep internal. It's kind of on like a case-by-case basis. But we are actually trying to be better about open sourcing more of that stuff too. I know the Sitecore, a lot of the Sitecore specific stuff, probably not as interesting to students, because I know from my experience, I had no idea what Sitecore was before I got into this work. But Sitecore is like one of the really big CMSs, and it's built in C#. And yeah, we've open sourced a lot of stuff for Sitecore these days. Yeah. Do you have any idea about the front end side? I know there's a bunch of accelerators for the front end side, right? Yeah, I know there's a few for React and Vue, but I don't know the specifics, sorry. Yeah. Was there any questions from the chat? No, perfect.
I actually
So
have one question.
Yep.
Just like about being a business analyst, because I haven't worked in that field, but
Yep.
like, what do they do, basically?
Did you get that right? What do you actually do as a business analyst?
What do you do as in, not day to day, but like, what does, like, from when you first meet a client as a business analyst, like, what are you helping them to do, or like, what problems are you solving? Are you analyzing their financials of the business, or are you doing other, like?
Oh, I see what you're asking. Yeah, right. So like, like, you got it right?
Oh, no, Chris, tell me.
No, I was only rephrasing the question for you. I was not. I don't know what the answer is.
I think I heard that. I know it's such a frustratingly consulting answer, but it depends. So it depends what the project is, and it depends on the scope. So right now I'm working on there's a banking transformation project. So what we're doing, an example of what we would do here is a lot of requirement gathering sessions with various stakeholders. So essentially a lot of meetings where we go out to different groups and we say, what are your challenges? What do you need? We map it. We essentially put it on a page. And then we look at some solutions, and we work with different technical teams to look at what sort of solutions we can find to what challenges we found in our discussions with the business. And then we take that back to the business and we say, hey, these are some proposed solutions. Do you think that this might work for you? And then it essentially just, it's a continuation of this, of taking this back and forth between the different teams and SMEs and trying to find the right solution. And then this essentially all forms part of the software delivery lifecycle, which is essentially what carries us from the initial discussion of here's the challenge or the problem to full solution delivery through design, analysis, design, build, and then test, and then release. So we essentially are the people that keep things supposedly in check along the way. We document a lot, we talk a lot, but our essential job is to have a very deep and thorough understanding of exactly what the issues are and what the proposed solutions are, and also the way that we're going to get to the end of that. What we don't do is actually propose what the solutions are. So our job is not to say, we can see the challenge, this is how you're going to solve it. Our job is to essentially facilitate that discussion between the experts, which are people like Chris, to say these are the various technical solutions that could be used in order to solve this problem. Does that answer the question? I sort of only heard half of it, so I did take a guess there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have a question. Is the banking which bank is the banking transformation?
Not sure if we're allowed to answer that. I don't know if we're allowed to answer that. Do you know if we're allowed to answer what bank, Riley? I don't think so.
I don't think so. I err on the side of caution, so no.
Me too. I try. There's a lot of cases where we absolutely can, but I tend to veer on the side of not saying, just in case. Some people 100% fine. Some clients don't necessarily like to advertise it as much. Did you have a follow-up question with that, or were you just curious about which bank it was?
It's because I was talking to BOQ and they said they're doing a transformation very soon with Me Bank, taking over Me Bank, and they were planning to do a big bang approach. And I asked why they're doing a big bang approach, but they don't know why. So I was like, well, if it's Deloitte, I can ask them why they decided to use a big bang approach.
I definitely can't answer that, but they did buy ME Bank recently, so like they'd definitely be doing something like in that space, I'd imagine. Like usually what happens, so like BOQ buying ME Bank, or like I know also like this is definitely not a client of ours, but like Sun Super and Q Super recently doing a merger as well, right? And like that is an area where consultants get involved quite a lot, is when one company buys another. And it wasn't really an example I had there, but when you've got two companies that have well-defined systems and like well-defined practices, so superannuation, super regulated, banks, very heavily regulated. And when you've got two solutions that are very heavily regulated but also quite different from each other, and you're a company that's bought another one, like trying to merge them together is, as you can probably imagine, extremely, extremely complicated. And that's where people, especially people with background in those areas, but also that come from a BA perspective, like Riley, for example, is super useful, is because they can sit there and like untangle some of the legal side of it, some of the like regulation side of it, and then also bring in like the people who can answer the more specific parts of that, but also bring in the technical people to answer the technical side, and then how do you manage that is a very complicated question. So I can't speak to specifics for that, but like in general though, it is somewhere where consultants would get involved because it is very complicated to understand what you do, and also, as you say, understand why you would do that, right? Like, because at somewhere along the line, hopefully there's been a decision made, and like I can tell you from experience in various companies that like sometimes companies will do things for no real apparent reason. And then when it doesn't work, bring consultants in to say, hey, why didn't this work? And the first question usually like, why did you do this? And like everyone's sort of like, someone told us it was a good idea. And like honestly, sometimes it's consultants come in and say it's a good idea too, right? Like it can go both ways. Like sometimes consultants will come in and recommend. And again, this gets partly to that advisory versus implementation side too, right? Where like people can come in and recommend something with the best of intentions and genuinely like mean it in a good way, but then it either doesn't work out for a whole slew of reasons. That can be, it was implemented badly, but it could also just mean it was bad recommendations. And it's hard to know at the time you're making recommendations, like the exact impact. We can do our best, but not everyone knows every possible outcome, right? And then often what will happen is consultants will come in, recommend one thing, they'll try that, it doesn't work for whatever reason, and then companies will go either way, right? They'll either go, consultants are evil, we'll never go with consultancy again, or they'll go to a different consultancy and say, hey, these other guys broke this, can you fix this? And it's kind of like, you do get kind of like a circular kind of thing sometimes where like people come along and fixing the previous company's mistakes. Any more questions?
Wrap it up there,
Yeah.
because it is waiting. Round of applause.
Perfect, yeah. Thank you guys.